Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service in this early 2023. Today is Wednesday, January 4th of the new year. If you want additional weather information on top of what I provide, go to weather.gov. It's a point-and-click interactive map. It'll give you forecast, watches, warnings, advisories anywhere in the country. Biggest weather story these days, a series of powerful Pacific storms are going to impact the western U.S., especially California, with heavy rainfall, flooding, high winds. There will be a series of storms now through mid-month to impact the western continental U.S. that will be in the news for at least the next couple of weeks. Here in Alaska, we had an active aurora visible last night, this past Tuesday evening, due to a coronal mass ejection arriving. It was visible across areas that had some clearing, and especially across much of Canada last night. Air quality alert for North Pole, a stage 2, and Fairbanks, a stage 1 air quality alert through early Thursday afternoon. But overall, relatively quiet weather will take us here through the end of the week in most areas of the state. We are going to see temperatures cool down across the western mainland as we go through, head up toward mid-month, but stormy and wet weather will continue across California, helping to drive the overall long wave pattern. Now, looking at a quick check here of a couple of the FAA webcams this Wednesday afternoon. Point Lay, partly cloudy on the breezy side. One of the colder temperatures there, northwest coast at 0 degrees. In the far southeast, Heidelberg, Metlakatla, cloudy skies, a few sprinkles, 45 degrees, so nearly a 50-degree temperature spread there across the state. And as I mentioned earlier, no notable advisories or warnings, but we do have the air quality alerts in effect for the Fairbanks and North Pole areas in the central interior through early Thursday afternoon. Looking at the satellite imagery, you can see the curl in the clouds, very bright enhanced clouds there in the lower right of your screen that's associated with this powerful storm now impacting California and much of the western U.S. Here in Alaska, still have a couple of swirls in the clouds there in Kodiak Island, pushing back toward the southwest interior, and a series of smaller lows along and south there of the western half of the Aleutians. This afternoon, there is a weak area of low pressure, Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, weak high pressure over the northwestern Canada from areas of the lower Yukon and through the British Columbia. And then we have a couple of lows back out toward the western Aleutians, with the deepest low there in the lower right of your screen off the coast of California. And then tonight into early Thursday morning, we continue to see weak low pressure along the southwest coast, southeast Bering, also along and north of the western half of the Aleutian chain, with a couple of troughs, one extending northward through the Seward Peninsula, lower Chukchi Sea, and a couple others there toward the Alcan border. And for Thursday afternoon, low continues to sit and spin well to the southeast there, down off the west coast and off the coast there of Washington, Oregon. Back in Alaska, weak low pressure there, lower Yukon Delta, and a couple lows back toward the Aleutians and North Pacific. Into Friday, the lows continue to sit and spin there, especially back toward the western Aleutians. Not much going on across the mainland, weak high pressure there, northwest Canada. And temperature-wise, as we go here through the next couple of days, lows tonight will generally be above freezing the outer western and southern portion of the panhandle in the far southeast. Some readings below 0, Northway 12 below, probably be down around 2 to 5 below there, Arctic Village. Single digits along the Arctic coast, and even there at the Bering Strait around Wales or Teller. And then Thursday afternoon highs could hit 40 again from places like Sitka down through Klawak and Craig. 37 at Kodiak City, and above freezing there, extending out the Aleutians. Single digits generally above 0, north slope, and through the central and eastern interior along the Yukon and upper Tanana valleys. Lows Friday morning, we'll see some more sub-zero readings, but not terribly cold for this time of year. Readings still above freezing there through the southern portion of the panhandle. And then afternoon highs on Friday, we'll get back up into the lower 40s, Metlakatla, westward through Klawak and up towards Sitka. Still below freezing, northern panhandle, 29 there around Skagway and Haines. There are going to be a couple of weather systems that work their way up through the panhandle Friday into the weekend. Generally rain, though in the higher elevations and toward the intercoastal mountains, it'll be in the form of some snow, perhaps enough to issue an advisory, but not a major type of winter storm. Nothing like what's rolling into the west coast of the continental U.S. And then back further north and west, high temperatures stay just below zero there through the Yukon Flats, Arctic Village, and near zero there up along the North Slope and Arctic coast. Meanwhile, along areas of the Norton Sound, highs generally in the mid-teens, and then generally above freezing as you extend out along the Alaska Peninsula up through the Aleutians. So again, the overall weather pattern relatively quiet the next couple of days. Temperatures not really at one extreme or another. Looking though at the 6 to 10 day temperature outlook, January 10th through the 14th as we lead up toward mid-month, temperatures are expected to cool along the western mainland and get a bit below normal, especially centered around Norton Sound and the Yukon Delta, including Nome and Bethel. The eastern half of the mainland generally near normal temperatures and maybe a little above normal there for the southeast, including much of the panhandle. Precipitation is forecast to average a little below normal there in the west from around Kotzebue Sound, Norton Sound, including Kotzebue, Nome, and Bethel. A little above normal, potentially areas from Anchorage eastward through Northway and across the panhandle, but no really big anomalies. The really wet and stormy weather is going to continue there down across the western U.S., especially California.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
It's now time to look at your aviation weather. If you have a flight planned either Thursday or Friday, we're going to be watching a couple of weak areas of low pressure in the southwest, lower Yukon Delta, in through Bristol Bay, also kind of a fading low there on the south end of the Kenai. A couple of troughs in the interior, especially up through the north, and then a couple of lows back toward the western portion of the Aleutians. We do anticipate rather widespread IFR conditions along areas of the Chukchi Sea coast, including St. Lawrence down south through Nunavik Island and much of the southwest coast, YK Delta's Bristol Bay. Also some pockets there, IFR around Prince William Sound. And then as we get into Thursday afternoon, IFR conditions will persist along the southwestern portion of the Alaska Range back up into the southwest interior, Norton Sound, lower Yukon Delta, St. Lawrence, and Seward Peninsula. And we look for Friday morning the IFR conditions to expand at least eastward across the southwestern interior up through the western half of the Alaska Range, areas along and south of the Brooks Range, and again back through the Seward Peninsula. By Friday afternoon, IFR conditions should be rather pervasive along and north and west of the Alaska Range, extending up along the Yukon River Basin and the western half of the Brooks Range, including the Seward Peninsula. Also some pockets there in through areas of the northern Panhandle. Now, Anatuvik Pass should generally see MVFR conditions for Thursday, as will Adigan Pass. And then as we go into the lower portion of the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill should generally hold on to IFR conditions, as will Rainy Pass. Windy Pass MVFR conditions will be the case as we round up through the central into the eastern portion of the Alaska Range, including Isabel Pass MVFR, though Mentasta may be a little pocket of VFR. It'll be surrounded by areas of MVFR to the north, south, and west. Further south and west, Tanita Pass, generally MVFR conditions are expected on Thursday. Portage Pass, IFR conditions, especially the eastern half of the pass, extending out over the western part of Prince William Sound, should become MVFR as we get into Thursday afternoon. And then in the far northern part of the Panhandle, Chilkoot and White, we'll see a pocket of IFR there to start Thursday, giving way to MVFR conditions. Freezing levels at the surface run from the central Bering out across the Alaska Peninsula to the northern Gulf Coast, and then through the inner channels of the Panhandle to along the British Columbia coast. Freezing levels aloft rise up to and above 2,000 feet through the southern half of the Panhandle to as much as 4,000 feet there, Haida Gwaii, and then 6,000 feet off of Vancouver. Icing potential is greatest areas around Haida Gwaii, British Columbia coast above 6,000 feet. There could be some isolated moderate icing. As we go further west, above 3,000 feet there, the Alaska Peninsula and much of the southwest, and above 3,000 feet there through the central Aleutians. And then as we go further north, deeper into the colder air, areas around the Seward Peninsula, including the east side of the Brooks Range, northern Yukon Flats, could see some icing above 1,000 feet. At 30,000 feet or jet stream level, the most notable feature is a high centered over central Canada, with the circulation around that bringing in southerly flow across the Panhandle upwards to 80 knots, extending up into the Yukon Territory. As we bring it down to 9,000 feet or 700 millibars, the high remains there over southwest Canada, with weak low pressure, mid-level circulation there off east of Kodiak Island, bringing in generally southerly flow in through the northern and eastern Gulf Coast. As we go back west, weak low there in the eastern Bering, then back out toward the western Aleutians, and then finally down to 3,000 feet, a little stronger low circulation situated south of Haida Gwaii, bringing south component winds there just offshore of Vancouver, upwards of 60 and 75 knots. Weak circulation there south end of the Kenai Peninsula back toward the Yukon Delta, and then area of low pressure in the western Aleutians, and then south and southwest of the central Aleutians. Greatest probability or areas of moderate turbulence will be there off the British Columbia coast around Haida Gwaii, surface to 6,000 feet as we go west. Areas of moderate turbulence possible across the southwest interior, west of the Alaska Range, and then dropping down across northern areas of the Alaska Peninsula, including Bristol Bay, and then further west in through the central and western Aleutians from the surface to 3,000 feet. So that wraps up your flight weather. If you do have a flight planned coming up here for Thursday, check the latest conditions and have a safe flight.
When I first started working here in the early 90s, this is where the glacier was. I mean, where we're walking right now would have been a pile of gravel that had been pushed up by the glacier, and then we would have had 100 to 200 foot high cliffs of ice right here. And as you can see, that's changed quite a bit. And if you look at that in 2 dimensions, you can sort of see the terminus used to be here, now it's back there. That gives you one measure. What that kind of 2-dimensional look doesn't show is how much mass has been lost, that the glacier has just sort of deflated. These 200-foot cliffs of ice have disappeared and pulled back to this gentle sloping glacier you see now.
When I was working in Kenai Fjords National Park, I used the topographic maps to navigate where I was, and I realized that the mapping of the glaciers was really off. The glaciers had receded a lot. There were new rivers and lakes that were establishing where the ice used to be or should have been according to the maps. And so then I did a study on this and found out that we had a 5% loss of glacier ice mass in the Kenai Fjords area between 1950 and 1985. A big change.
You know, one of the most compelling things we do, though, to document glacier change is simply take photographs. We've had repeat photography projects here at the park. They may not give you the most accurate data in terms of how much mass or real specific measurements, but what they do give you is a visual representation that can't be argued with. I mean, it really requires no interpretation.
Understanding what's happening, understanding these processes, and possibly being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is the best that we can do, and that requires science and research.
There's considerable research on climate change in Alaska. The most significant, I would say right now, is the Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring Program, which is looking at change across a wide variety of vital signs or indicators.
Kenai Fjords National Park is actually a pretty good representation of what's going on globally with regards to glacier ice retreat. There have been studies showing that mountain glaciers are retreating all over the planet. There are probably well over 90% of the glaciers are in retreat status. There are a few that are advancing, and some are holding, their terminus point. But at Kenai Fjords, the tidewater glaciers are retreating more dramatically, but even the land-based glaciers in the terminus positions are retreating. It's pretty common for all the mountain glaciers. The big mountain glaciers in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, they're mostly in retreat too. We're really entering an interesting phase where what we call the cryosphere, the ice on the planet, is melting.
You know, in the more immediate past, it's clear that since the Pleistocene, glaciers have been retreating. So the idea that glaciers retreat is no revelation. They've been retreating from across North America for the last 10,000 years. What appears to have changed and what has people's attention is the rate at which they're retreating. In the case of Exit Glacier, we have scientists who've been looking at it. We have evidence that the glaciers left behind, where we can track that retreat for about the last 200 years. And we can say with confidence that in the last decade, that rate has increased.
Terminus mapping is a great way to map a small portion of the ice field. We come out twice a year and we use a GPS to walk the edge of the terminus and map the farthest extent of Exit Glacier. And that allows us to see what type of changes are occurring over the winter accumulation period and the summer ablation period. With that data, that can help us as we witness these changes within the ice field, we can hopefully be able to correlate that with the weather data that we have.
When you look at an ice field that's 750 square miles, when you look at a glacier that towers hundreds of feet high, you get a sense of permanence. You think these things are massive, they're somehow a permanent sort of feature, and yet in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of decades, we've seen dramatic change in those things.
At Exit Glacier, we have a time-lapse camera set up on the glacier that allows us to take a couple photos every single day, and then to put that sequence of photos into a video where we can see changes of the glacier and the vegetation phenology throughout an entire year.
Virtually all the glaciers in Alaska are receding. Some glaciers are moving forward. That's not an indication that they're actually growing in size. It's just the rate at which they're slipping down the mountain.
In some cases, some of these glaciers are receding back up onto land, and so they're producing less ice. When you change a glacier systems, you're changing habitat for marine mammals and other wildlife. And the populations of harbor seals have dropped dramatically in the fjords. In 1980, shortly after the establishment of the park, in Island Bay, we had maybe 1,500 harbor seals. Nowadays, it's a few hundred.
In Arctic environments, much of the sunlight that reaches the Earth bounces back because it hits snow and reflects off into space, or ice on the ocean and reflects off into space. That's the albedo effect. When the snow thaws and instead you have rock or vegetation, or when the ice thaws and you have transparent ocean, the sunlight will convert to other wavelengths. It'll convert essentially to warmth. That does not bounce back into the atmosphere as much. So consequently, you get a warming of the ocean, you get a warming of the ground, you get a thawing of frozen soils or permafrost, you get a more rapid thawing of sea ice. So once the ice and once the snow is off of the surface, the rate of warming increases considerably.
If you're driving out to Exit Glacier, you'll actually start to see signs along the side of the road that have dates on them. Visitors sometimes are confused. They think they're elevations or something until they get up to the glacier and realize, oh, those were all date signs along the road that were telling me when the glacier was there. Another thing that's been happening in the Exit Glacier area in recent years is this flooding that comes at a time we're not used to. We're used to having maybe some flooding in the fall when we have a lot of heavy rain. This has suddenly been some flooding that's coming in the middle of the summer, usually not associated with precipitation events. It's associated with warmer weather and melting. When you walk down one of our trails that leads to Exit Glacier, there are a number of ways to get out there, but what used to be the main route is is no longer really the main route because of the way the glacier has changed. So this main route to the glacier used to provide dramatic views of the glacier as you walk towards it. In fact, there was a large kiosk built at the end of this trail for people to stop and rest and enjoy the view of the glacier. Now, if they stop and rest at this kiosk, people think, why did the park put a kiosk here? Because it looks out at some shrubs. There's no glacier within view anymore.
The way we solve big problems like this is not all at once. There's a thing called the Sokolov's wedges, and you just take a little bite of the pie, one sliver at a time. So we try to do incremental changes.
When we talk to people about our concerns about climate change, about the changes that are happening to the glacier, we also want to leave them with some idea of what we're doing to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. For example, here at the park, as we retire vehicles out of our fleet, we try to replace them with electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We've done things like at the Glacier Nature Center, helping to sort of experiment and install a cutting-edge fuel cell as opposed to running some traditional power source out there that relies on some sort of more greenhouse-producing gas.
My main hope for the future is that people get the message that the planet is changing fairly rapidly in places, particularly places like Kenai Fjords National Park, and that it is, we think, there's good evidence it's a result of atmospheric changes, which are measured in terms of human inputs into the atmosphere.
The rapid rate at which these glaciers are changing now offers us the opportunity to talk about this place as a way of looking into the future. In a lot of parts of the country, climate change issues are a little more subtle, and we can point here and say, look how fast this is changing. This is what the future holds for perhaps a lot of us and a lot of the planet as climate continues to change.
I'm optimistic that people and nature will adapt to change, but my expectation is that change will occur. Time will tell.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and let's start off with the sea ice edge, as we always do with the marine weather segment. Extensive ice exists now throughout the North Arctic coast down through the Chukchi Sea coast and surrounding the Seward Peninsula, including Norton Sound and around St. Lawrence Island. We don't foresee any super strong winds to really shift the ice around a ton, but the ice is going to have a tendency, at least there in the northern and central Bering, to want to push west and southward. And it's certainly possible by sometime early next week that we could get the ice in the vicinity of St. Matthew. But you can see the ice extends down along the southwest coast and through Kuskokwim Bay, areas of Bristol Bay, and expanding, or it has expanded a bit there, in through the northern half of Cook Inlet. Well, the marine forecast for Thursday for the inner channels of the Panhandle, north winds 25 knots down through Lynn Canal and Petersburg, waves around 5 feet. Winds are more east-southeast, though, on the south end, Ketchikan, Metlakatla, 15 knots with 3-foot waves. The outer coast, look for offshore flow, generally out of the northeast and east, 20 to 30 knots, strongest south of Sitka, waves running about 6-7 feet, Yakutat to off of Gustavus, but as high as 11 to 15 feet, Sitka south through Craig. For Friday, we're going to start to see some gale force winds creep up with the next weather system, and winds will be out of the southeast, 25-30 knots, middle and southern inner channels, waves 5 to as much as 10 feet there, Dixon entrance. North winds, though, 30 knots, gusting as high as 45 knots, Lynn Canal with 6-foot waves. And along the outer coast, south of Sitka, 30 to 35 knot winds, waves 17 feet, and east to northeast winds, Gustavus through Yakutat, waves 14 to 16 feet. Across the northwestern Gulf, winds will generally have some sort of easterly component, northeasterly down much of the length of Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound, 15 to 20 knots, waves a few feet there. The entrance of Cook Inlet, 15 to 20 knots from the southeast with waves 5 to 6 feet. On Friday, Winds take on a little more northerly component, 10 to as high as 20 knots down through the lower portion of Cook Inlet with waves there 5 feet. 15 knots out of the north, Prince William Sound, waves 2 feet, and winds off the Kenai generally around 15 to 20 knots, waves 6 feet. For areas of the southwest, including the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, generally variable winds around 10 knots, but an east to southeast component of 10 to 15 knots there. Especially south and east of Kodiak Island. Waves 5 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side, 2 to 3 feet on the Bering side. And for Friday across the region, winds will generally be out of the northeast at about 10 to 15 knots. Waves 6 to 9 feet on the North Pacific side and 2 to 4 feet from Bristol Bay down to north of Cold Bay. Across the Aleutians on Thursday, winds not especially strong, but generally out of the southwest, 20 to 25 knots. Waves 8 to 11 feet on the North Pacific side, 5 to 9 feet on the Bering side, a little stronger as you get west of AKwx, southwesterly 25 to 30 knots. And for Friday, start to see some gale force winds creep upward into the central Aleutians at 35 knot southeasterly gales. Otherwise, generally out of the east there, 30 knots or so in the eastern Aleutians. Waves 8 to as high as 13 feet on the North Pacific side and generally 6 to 10 feet on the Bering side for areas east of AKwx. And across the southwest coast, extensive ice there. The ice will slowly make some progress toward the west and southwest and could be nudging up again into around St. Matthew by early next week. Otherwise, winds generally out of the north have a northerly component, northeast to north, turning northwesterly. Variable, though, St. Matthew down towards St. Paul. Waves generally 5 feet there, and where there is still open water. And then for Friday, look for light southeast winds, 5 knots there in Norton Sound, and generally somewhat of an easterly component to the winds coming off the ice, as high as 20 knots there around St. Matthew and St. Paul with waves of 6 feet. Then finally, along the Arctic coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots with ice in place. There could be some moving around of the ice there, along with some blowing snow. And as we drop down through the Chukchi Sea, we expect winds to go east and then turn northerly to 20 knots through the Bering Strait, again with plenty of ice in place. And for Friday, east winds 25 to 30 knots along the Arctic coast, turning again more toward the northeast and north through the lower Chukchi Sea and Bering Strait at about 15 knots with the ice holding in place. So that wraps up our show here for this Wednesday, the 4th day of January 2023. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join me again tomorrow evening.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.